Thank you so much for those of you who are here this afternoon, and it's a joy and an honor and a privilege to have Leticia Alvarado and now Bustamante here with us today. This is an event put on by the Global South Center, and we're excited to really highlight kind of performance studies, Chicanx studies, Latinx studies, kind of questions of queer performance, and a number of ways to think about practice today. So I want to start by just introducing our guest speakers and also tell you a little bit about how we'll run the event. Thank you. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Guillermo. You're fine. You're good. Okay. So I just want to start by saying a little bit about how we'll run the event today. And the way we'll do it is we'll have Leticia Alvarado speak first, and she will speak for, maybe 15, 20 minutes, however long you'd like to, Leticia. And then now we'll speak, and then we'll have a conversation between the two of them and also really engage the audience on that. So Leticia Alvarado is an assistant professor of ethnic studies and American studies in the Department of American Studies at Brown University. I think of her as an associate professor because her wonderful book is out and has been making all the rounds. Her research is really interdisciplinary, and it's situated at multiple fields: Latinx studies, visual culture, gender and sexuality studies. Her first book is called Abject Performances, Aesthetic Strategies, and Latino Cultural Production, and that's Duke University Press, and that came out last year. And it's an important book because it draws out these kind of unsuspecting connections, irreverent connections, disruptive aesthetic strategies that are used by Latinx artists and cultural producers, and who also shun standards of respectability. So it's not unusual to find in her book discussions of caca, asco, vomiting, all kinds of affective, disruptive responses that one might have to difficult art, to certain kinds of politics, and this becomes really important kind of book of theory and grounded research that brings the categories of abjection forward to us. I also want to suggest that not only does she do kind of closed performative readings, but she also thinks of performance studies in relationship to social research and analysis, and does research inside a church, does research about kind of collective bodies and in relationship to Latino social movements. So thinking about the kind of choreography of Latinx bodies in relationship to social critique, and really refusing a politics of identity, but really thinking about coherence of particular kinds of convergences or communities as one potentiality for kind of future politics. I think also what's interesting, is during the course of her writing the book, the term Latinx kind of gained more currency, and so it's interesting at different moments that she does use that X and doesn't. But I really want to mark this because I think the X in Latinx does exactly the kind of disruptive work that you do in abject performances, which is to mark the space that we can't necessarily demarcate through something like binarized gender categories. It refuses a kind of coherence, and to me it really does that performative work as well. Centrally, her work also contends with now Bustamante's body of work. And she does a beautiful reading in the book of America the Beautiful, a performance that she calls, quote, "It makes a mockery of all the disciplinary techniques for beautifying the body and the decorum of femininity," end quote. So there's a real kind of engagement with Now's work that I think is really important. Alvarado's research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the Smithsonian, and Brown University's Riston Fellowship for Excellence in Teaching and Scholarship. And before joining the faculty at Brown, Alvarado taught at Wesleyan University and NYU, where she completed her PhD in American Studies. So thank you, Leti, for being with us. Now, Bustamante is also here with us, and it's a great pleasure. Yesterday we were talking about decolonial joy. I am feeling a lot of decolonial joy for this panel today, and also for now being here. Actually, the panel had many potential iterations of how we were going to do it, and I'm really happy we settled on this kind of author meets critic slash performance meets critic author conversation. Now, Bustamante is a Chicana artist, performance, and multimedia internationally known artist, and her work has actually been featured by many academics. How many of you have read at least one or two books in which Nao's work is featured? Yes, exactly right. So many people have seen this work as worthy of real engagement, including Jose Munoz, the great late Jose Munoz, and also in Leticia Alvarado's book, as I just mentioned. So I've had the privilege of actually seeing Nao perform several times. I saw her in America the Beautiful, in Deathbed. I saw the film and performance of Silver and Gold. And I also want to especially highlight the beautiful museum exhibition she did at VPAM with Jennifer Doyle as the curator of that in East Los Angeles in 2015 at the Vincent Price Art Museum. That was really an important set of works that thought about the complex relationship between the kind of Mexican Revolution and the camera, and how the camera kind of is taken centrally in that work. But she also kind of writes back the presence of the soldera figure, the woman revolutionary figure during the 1910 revolution. And we can maybe talk to her and think about the dresses. Maybe she'll show some today, which I think are really beautiful about the exhibition itself. For me, the most poignant work was at a Hemi Encuentro a couple of years ago, a dedication, a kind of mourning, poetic, performative work called Somewhere, My Love, which was dedicated to Jose Munoz. And it was such a powerful performance, dressed in black, like a widow. The widow mourned this death, and there was a repetitive gesture that kept haunting us as an audience. One of the great performers of our time, Nao Bustamante. So join me in welcoming both Leti and Nao to this panel, and I look forward to your engagement this evening. Thank you.
I don't remember exactly when I first witnessed a carefully handled burrito fitted into a harness and offered up to audience members from the pelvis of artist Nao Bustamante as an act of salvation, absolution for 500 years of settler colonial sins offered to white men, individuals with inner white men, individuals who know white men, or folks in the audience that day in 1992 for the performance of Indie Dorito who might have been hungry. But I do remember the moment Bustamante became a principal interlocutor for my scholarship when my late mentor, Jose Munoz, handed me a compilation DVD of her work, you know, for the stuff on abjection, he told me. Bustamante soon became an anchor for the research that would become my recently published book that Maca gave us a gloss of. I am thrilled to share a room, a panel, a podium with her today, and thankful to Maca for hosting us. Drawing from my book, today I'll offer thoughts on the work of abjection and Bustamante's oeuvre, tracing the development of the incorporation of difference from the early 1990s to the era of Obama, to ask what might Bustamante's aesthetics of abjection offer us for the present moment. In other words, as I prepared for today, my animating question was, what would Nao Bustamante do now? Would Bustamante slip into her harness and offer up her burrito? Who would she invite into her ritual for salvation? Before turning to these questions, I'll first elaborate the aesthetic mode of this and other performances, ones I call the aesthetics of abjection. My book, Abject Performances, takes as its premise the idea that the aesthetic mode of abjection has and can still offer us strategies for navigating a phobic majoritarian public sphere. I contend that instead of turning to works whose techniques we might call realist, illustrative, or journalistic, techniques Often marshaled in the service of positive representation and appeals for the national incorporation of minoritized communities, we consider concurrent routes charted through objection to glean strategies distinct to those we've come to understand as politically efficacious. Throughout, I extend an invitation to center the aesthetic, to understand the structured organization of the sensorial as central to the workings of power, augment our conceptualization of minoritized populations, as well as offer us enriched politicized ideation. Given scholarship that has shown us the centrality and indeed mutual constitutiveness of cultures of taste and distinction, to those that inform racial formation, I grapple with canonical field-forming theories of aesthetics, specifically the influential Kantian rubrics of the beautiful and sublime, arguing this foundational work must be engaged to make sense of dominant structuring logics of aesthetics and its effects on contemporary elaborations of race. Lest you think this appeal removes us from the quotidian or places us beyond the popular, I turn to Bustamante and a brief vignette from my book's third chapter. Bravo TV's first season of Work of Art, The Next Great Artist from 2010 included our very own Bustamante among its 14 participants. Bustamante's elimination, the fourth of the televised competition, occurs after her performance piece, Barely Standing, failed to elicit the measured shock called for in the episode's challenge to create, quote, a shocking piece of art. A calculated skill the show's judges and creative producers seem to think a necessary ability for the telesphere's next great artist. When asked to explain her performance, Bustamante instead engaged her judges in a conversation about process, an elaboration of where she was trying to arrive and what wasn't supposed to be, but ended up being read by her audience. Echoes of an earlier proclamation, I'm not responsible for your experience of my work, lingered in the air between artist and judges. Bustamante refused to provide a coherent narrative to explain what her judges perceived as masturbatory fecal play with the shit flower blossoming from her plastic bag upholstered pelvis. A reading Bustamante would neither confirm nor reject. The visibly distraught collective of judges found a representative voice in Jerry Saltz, the resident art critic who summarized the discussion and provided what would later serve as the logic for Bustamante's dismissal as follows. So you don't really know what this piece is. We don't know what the piece is, and it comes off, therefore, as incredibly familiar, kind of adolescent mixed with shock your grandmother performance. By contrast, the challenge winner, Abdi Farah, presented the judges a well-rehearsed explanation of his IED's improvised explosive device. My piece is titled IED, he explains. So many of our cities are so disenfranchised, stricken by poverty, family structures are destroyed, and thusly kids grow up as these improvised explosive devices. So I have these 3 black male portraits, and I'm depicting them as bombs. The work is accessible on multiple registers. Aesthetically, it is representational and illustrative of the narrative he provides. They are time bombs metaphorically and rendered this way literally, achieving similitude. Additionally, he announces the piece's immediate import as evidenced by its political content, race, class, family values, specifically through or against the pathological black family. He crafts a piece that reflects on social injustice and builds a visual, non-disruptive metaphor for not only contemplation, but enjoyment. The word used by one of the judges, quote, the more that she heard about the work. Farah here acknowledges social injustice, even as his presence speaks to the viability of the bootstrap model for success and art as a pathway for escape. Bustamante, on the other hand, seems to evoke the opposite of enjoyment, particularly in her refusal of narrative accessibility of both her work and character. In addition to refusing to explain her work as illustrative of a concept for placid contemplation, Bustamante refuses to perform the identitarian archetypes her fellow artist contestants embraced: feminist, bad boy, artist of color, etc. She refuses, in other words, what we might call, after Ray Chow, the hail of coercive mimeticism. Coercive mimeticism and the trap of model protesting ethnic comportment. Modeled after its successful sibling antecedents, Project Runway and Top Chef, work of art elaborated a caricature of Kantian aesthetic judgment that reflects broad approaches to the creation, reception, and judgment of cultural production. Here, as for Kant, the successful or true artist is presented as a genius with innate aptitude whose production of fine art is operationally concerned with attaining beauty through similitude or representational authenticity. Art's judgment is spurred by positive pleasure, that enjoyment one of the judges identifies as she smiles at Farah's IEDs, distinct from moving emotion, which Kant considers foreign to beauty. In other words, a response still within the bounds of appropriate disinterest, a defining characteristic of Kantian judgment. Through this prerequisite, Kant establishes a connection between the moral and the aesthetic that pretends universality, a universality that indeed produces, as David Lloyd has argued, an unmarked subject without properties, a subject we know was forged in differentiation to the expanse of unknown at the brink of nascent and growing empires. This comes to be a normalized subject, present in the example above, in the judges Bustamante coaxes out of placid contemplation. The presence of this rubric outlining the relationship between the artist, judge, and each of their approaches to interpreting the sensorial, here on cable television, and its marriage to institutional incitements to perform, underlines the importance of rigorous engagement with the theoretical apparatus that has informed the formation of art history as a field and process that now seeps into the everyday and widely accessible format of television, especially for the consideration of the visual field within which Latinidad is signified. Against the assuring pleasure of beauty, by focusing on objection, my book taps into that other, much more complicated and vexed category of judgment Kant explored, the sublime. This is an aesthetic judgment triggered more by what Kant described as negative pleasure and the paradoxical quality of formlessness, a characteristic that led me to center the performative, given its resistance to restrictive formal parameters in favor of temporal drag, and to turn to artists like now Bustamante. At once pleasurable and repulsive, effectively proximal to the unknowing, awe and wonder, incapable of blurring into terror, for me the sublime is tinged with uncertainty and anxiety provoked by the emergence of quote-unquote new worlds, revealing fissures within the dominant organizing logic for aesthetic engagement derived from the famed Enlightenment philosopher. A fissure from which the cultural producers of my study can coax openings, enact disruptions, indeed destabilize foundations through abjection. Laden with quotidian meaning, I understand abjection as tied to a negative process of subject formation, the necessary excess to be cast out in order for the normative subject to cohere. This process allows us to reflect on the formation of a national identity cohered by the casting out of undesirable bodies, people of color, queer folks, whose own interiority is diminished. The result is a prognosis of the establishment of dominance through the repeated casting out of those subjects who threaten to reveal the inequality of a national body insistent on a legacy of freedom and equality. Building specifically on critical race and Latinx scholarship, I understand this abject realm as comprised of a largely minoritized populace, providing a site to think about collectivity through negative affect, as well as resistant engagement with identity politics writ large, homing in on what Juana Maria Rodriguez has called abjection's world-making potential, especially when wielded as an aesthetic strategy. Of her work of art elimination piece, Barely Standing, Bustamante has said, I think there was a deep sadness expressed in the work, and I think that did come across for the viewers in the gallery. I also thought the work looked beautiful on TV. When I saw it, it looked so beautiful, I thought I would scream. When she says the piece looked beautiful, I think not of the favored Kantian category, but beauty as established in Bustamante's earlier work, most notably America the Beautiful, performed between 1995 and 98, and again in 2002 for the Hemispheric Institute. in front of live audiences across a variety of venues in which beauty is filtered through objection and critique of dominant standards for disciplining the racialized body, redeployed in work of art for a refusal of minority inclusion on neoliberal terms. Bustamante's America the Beautiful is a self-described body narrative, a tragic comedy that takes the viewer on bizarre circus-like adventure of ladder climbing and breath-holding tension. The critical gestures of the performance are best understood in relation to the political environment against which it was crafted, amidst the culture wars characterized by political campaigns to defund controversial art, especially that of queer artists and artists of color, but also a culture industry that increasingly called on artists to illustrate multicultural celebration. Such prompts gave us, for example, in Didgeridoo, with which I began my talk, as a response to funding incentives to create work that responded to the quincentennial celebration of Columbus's quote-unquote discovery. These incitements were paired with legislative xenophobia, most famously in the triptych of California Propositions 187, 209, and 227, which restricted access to public services to the U.S.-born children of undocumented immigrants and their parents, and ended affirmative action and bilingual education in California. In America the Beautiful, Bustamante reflects on the seemingly contradictory hails for proper participation in the life of the nation. The frame of the performance is deceptively straightforward. Bustamante moves onto the stage, disrobes, and prepares her body in front of her audience, applying beauty queen accoutrement with flourish. She curls her lashes as though with a tiny vice, applies lipstick in fluid ovals well beyond the borders of her lips, and finishes her face with a golden powder applied excessively over her entire visage. A long blonde wig, teased and set with an entire can of hairspray, precedes the repetitive process of sculpting her body with clear shipping tape. Once Bustamante has achieved a slender, big-haired silhouette, she accessorizes her look with white stiletto heels and evening-length gloves, ready to begin the talent portion of her performance, the, quote, bizarre circus-like adventure of ladder climbing and breath-holding tension. During this segment, each pose reveals the precarity of the body, the risk involved in movement always constrained by the demands of hegemonic beauty, which Bustamante has embodied to the point of clownish excess. In her extreme embodiment of literalized beauty guidelines, Bustamante presents not a genuine makeover, but a pointed parody. We are, for example, always aware of the wigginess of her wig, the failure of her shipping tape shapewear to truly contain her flesh, revealing a self that pre-transformation cannot be properly modified to the norm and reifies it in her attempts to make it do so. But Bustamante's performance persona completes the talent portion. When she completes the talent portion presentation, the applause solicited from her audience, the flowers she receives, do not satiate her. Instead, she is propelled into abjection quite literally through the corporeal rejection as she vomits the bouquet that was handed to her at the end of her talent presentation. Yes, this means she ate them, perhaps to satiate the need the audience's applause could not. For the final section of America the Beautiful, Bustamante offers an abject encore, a musical rendition of the national anthem achieved by blowing on liquid-filled bottles, which she stops occasionally to lick, to deep throat, before completing the performance by blowing a kiss up towards the stage light that illuminates her. As a whole, the piece makes a mockery of the disciplinary techniques for beautifying the body and the decorum of femininity. It renders the necessary performatives to incite the approval of spectators that will never satisfy the abject subject against and through whom a standard is formed. When read through the specificity of Bustamante's body, the performance is an abject reflection on minority inclusion. The techniques for disciplining the body that Bustamante's character follows will presumably grant her acceptance, inclusion as part of a society that favors blonde women with tapered waists. And while the audience claps, Bustamante's character is displeased with their hollow acceptance. Bustamante's performance, then, is one that critiques the terms of acceptance and inclusion. The applause will never be enough given the labor spent in a makeover that hasn't quite made her over, but reveals her attempts to do so. In this way, Bustamante makes evident the hypocrisy of a beautiful America that requires a certain performance for inclusion, a performance that in part encapsulates the exhibition and not elimination of her difference, and the ways it attempts to approximate but is never the norm. Channeling abjection in her suggestive anti-patriotic enunciation through queer non-human fellatio, the last section's irreverent rendition of the national anthem transposes the disciplining of the female body to the national body, teasing out the ways beauty, morality, and nation building are conjoined, but also the ways minority inclusion is part of the mythos of America's beauty. So when Bustamante describes barely standing as so beautiful she thought she would scream, I hear an invocation of the purposefully abject refusal of coercive mimeticism, an embrace of failure and disassociation, especially poignant when we consider work of art's release halfway through President Barack Obama's first presidential term, just a little over a year after Chief Justice Sotomayor's confirmation, but also amidst a surge in anti-immigrant legislation that recalled the California triptych against which Bustamante created America the Beautiful. Legislative efforts were galvanized by Arizona's SB 1070, at the time largely regarded as one of the toughest anti-immigrant laws, requiring individuals carry immigration documents at all time, at risk of being charged with a misdemeanor, but also giving the police broad power to detain anyone they suspected of being undocumented. Arizona's SB 1070 would serve as a model for Alabama's HB 56 and similar laws in Indiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and Utah. This seems like a good moment. I think we were supposed to see that a bit ago. Not yet. This seems like a good moment to note the development of my book alongside a dominant narrative of the success of representation and the incorporation of difference across visual scapes and institutional arenas. And if I'm being honest, a presumption on my part for the kind of apotheosis of liberal inclusion ushered in by a different presidential campaign outcome than the one we got. Which is to say, I believe we're in a different moment now than the one in which I conceptualized and wrote abject performances, one from which I don't yet have enough distance, but from within which I continue to seek routes that will deliver us to different ends, to successes that can't be so easily and quickly challenged, routes I hope I begin to illuminate in abject performances, following the cultural producers at its center, Bustamante among them. Because while recent bombastic neo-nativist utterances on the national stage may seem to call for a counter-strategy of creating distance between abjection and minoritized communities, conservative performances of racism only underscore what we in communities of color have long known about the structure of nationalist fervor. It is within the politics of respectability and its seemingly successful dynamic of incorporation, a known route we might be tempted to fall back on, that I instead seek to parse out strategies that continue to demand an expansion of what we understand as justice and freedom. The work of abjection, and now Bustamante's work, reveals abjection not as a resource for empowerment, fueled by a desire for normative inclusion, but as a resource geared towards an ungraspable alternative social organization, a necessary offering in the face of ICE impunity of Republican fascism. On June 14th, 2018, Bustamante announced on social media her intention to kill or retire Given Over to Want. On the origins of Given Over, Bustamante shared with me a dialectical process in which prior performance ghosts entangled with audience demands and desire. In preparation for her contribution to the Nippon International Performance Art Festival in 1999, Bustamante realized she would need to alter her plans given the inadequacy of the performance venue, a punk club, for the work that she had intended to perform. Having just killed America the Beautiful, she was equipped with its leftovers, materially a roll of tape, ethereally its big-haired ghosts. She intended to create an on-the-road America the Beautiful, but devised a haunting palimpsest. After transformation, visible only as shadow play, recalling the first section of America the Beautiful, but presented here behind the veil, Bustamante gives herself over in performance to desire and excess, lapping wine from a stabbed wine box to the point of gluttonous disruption of human boundedness, across a number of performances as transmogrified seance, given over gathered associations of disappearance and survival, especially when performed in Chile, where wine stains recalled not only the Catholic Eucharist, but also the likely torture and death of thousands who disappeared by the state during Pinochet's dictatorship. Bustamante had given herself over to grief, to lingering with loss and disappearance, institutional and lived violence, and it is ultimately committed to the melancholic stuckness in, as David Eng and David Kazanjian has theorized, the adamant refusal of foreclosure. At the October killing of Giving Over to Want, Bustamante released this ethos into a warm LA night, into now. The performance closed Bustamante's performance series in Cuatro Patas, co-curated with artist Sandra Ibarra. The artists featured in the series, Bustamante and Ibarra wrote, dissolve boundaries between animal and human while exploring the transformational and pleasurable possibilities of the non-human figure. Participating artists were invited to take on the corporal reality of the abject, the degraded, the non-human, the subhuman, the animal. An invitation repeatedly taken up by both artist curators. There is no harness here, no burrito, but Bustamante has given us a haunting caution against narratives of inclusion, of liberal celebration of diversity, along with an invitation to give ourselves over to imagining a different organization of the social, to give ourselves over to want, to desire for excess against the scarcity of the now. A want for another way of being beyond the status of the human already denied to so many of us, of color, queer, trans, who already move through the world otherwise. Thank you. I'm not going to play it. This one?
Hello. Thanks for being here with us. And hello to anyone out there in live stream land. I have a cold, so I'm a little bit, so please excuse me. I sound a little bit stuffy and I might cough, and I have my hot water here. But that was, it's so bizarre for me to hear in a way these kinds of talks about my work. Like I have to kind of, I kind of have these feelings where I sort of feel vulnerable, and then I almost want to cry because I'm like, this is so beautiful, and then I have to like disembody and sort of separate myself from what's being said in a way. And I think that in a way, and also when I see the work, and even the work I'm going to show you now, I do feel somewhat disembodied from the pieces, and I'm not sure if it's because I look at them and I think, God, why would you do that? You know, like I'm not sure if it's the abject aspects that I'm trying to separate myself from, or if it's actually a different persona, perhaps. And I think in some cases that could be true. See if I can. I'm just going to let this play for a moment. Could the volume be turned up, or can I do that from here? It's okay. Maybe on the next video will make more of a difference. Also, I'm just thinking, do we have to have the lights as bright? We do? Okay. We don't? Just in terms of the screen quality. So I'm going to take you today a little bit through some works, including some of the works that Leticia spoke about, around the ideas of moving from a kind of state of vulnerability to a state of protection with the work. Yeah, I think we're trying to still get some light sorted out here. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's better for the screen. It might be bad for the live stream, though, but no? Don't worry about it? Okay, I'm getting signs from people. But basically in this work, I'm rewinding the end of a movie over and over, and the movie is acting as a kind of emotional vibrator in order to draw out the sadness in me. And I was thinking about this way in which media performs this teaching role in our lives about how we relate to others, and it kind of teaches us a kind of framework for drama, and then we experience that drama and we reenact it, and then somebody takes those stories and they kind of condense them into a narrative that then they shoot and present in the framework of a movie or a play or sometimes a novel. And so I was thinking about that space of cinema and narrative and how it hooks into our own emotions. And I was wondering about that placement of emotion and how it's a kind of placeholder in some ways for maybe old pain or other kinds of emotion that may go unexpressed. So my idea for this work was that I would be able to play the end of a movie over and over to the point where I would lose emotion, that I would be then unable to cry any longer. And I was wondering if there was an end to that well of emotion, if I could find it, if I could sort of, the way that one might become numb to the pleasures of a vibrator, if I would become numb to the emotion of cinema. But in the end, I didn't find that end. It's about an 8-minute video. This was a 3-minute excerpt, and I never really found the point where I would stop crying. I just kind of got bored with myself, and so I decided to leave that space. And when it came time to display the work, it was a little bit confusing about what kind of space the work would want to live in. But at the same time, I was having this experience of my own TV in my home and how I would want to drape a scarf on it so that it wouldn't seem so much like a TV. And then I would put a little plant on it and then maybe a picture next to it or something. And after a while, I had sort of created like my grandmother's living room. Let's see if... And so I decided to kind of go in that direction and sort of display it in a sculpture that had a kind of, feminist fiber arts on steroid vibe, or a kind of ominous, like Frankenstein grandma, or something that was, undeniably in some way like feminist art, like within that realm, but also monstrous. And I think that tends to be a mode that I operate in a lot, which is a kind of monstrous mode, thinking through, feminist ideas. Here it is in the Broad. That's the backside. And you could see when people sit on the bench and put on the headphones, they're kind of tethered to the work, and they become part of the work, a lot like the way that the video is, kind of churning on itself, between like the concept of me receiving the emotion and creating the emotion at the same time. And I feel like the same way when the viewer views the piece, they're also connected to the sculpture itself. This is the point in my lecture where I usually fake a mental breakdown and begin to cry, and then I hypnotize the audience to be me, and then I show this slide. But we don't have time for that today, so I'm just going to show the slide and tell you that this is part of a ongoing digital portrait called Find Yourself Through Me. And it's a performance for one person and some onlookers, some voyeurs, where I hypnotize you to become me, and then I take a photo of you as myself, and I insert you in this digital portrait of me. And it's ongoing work. And I think of it as a kind of, it was either like the ultimate sort of solipsistic performance art achievement, or it was a kind of space of not feeling like I saw myself in my environment, and so kind of going to the extreme in recreating myself with others. At the end of the hypnosis, after I take their photo, I hypnotize them to become themselves again. And so the title, Find Yourself Through Me. This is not my work, but this is kind of how I think about my work, which is sort of more of a mandala, like crazy quilt, Frankenstein together, different pieces of my past and even my future. And I don't think about my work as a kind of linear space, but I think about it more that anything I have done, I can sort of take and reuse to find new pieces, in the same way that Leticia was talking about me pulling parts of America the Beautiful to create Given Over to Want. So I sort of see this palette that I'm building that I can pull from. You might recognize this image. It's it's from Indigirito. This is actually the only photograph I have of this work, and I was really lucky to even have this. It was a reporter happened to be on site. This is at the Women's Building in San Francisco. I only performed this 3 times in 1992, and it was very specific to the era. And I don't really remember who this guy was, but he did come up to me not that long ago at a party and said, "I'm the guy in the photo that you show in your lectures." And I was like, "Oh, amazing, thank you." I don't remember. So I wanted to kind of talk about this era also, because it sort of moves into looking at later these and also connecting to these spaces of media. But this was 1992. I was doing this character named Rosa as a kind of club character. And essentially, Rosa is also this character, and she's also this character. And she went on the Joan Rivers show as a exhibitionist. Does anyone here know, or does anyone here not know who Joan Rivers is, or maybe know? Joan Rivers, I'll just tell you, she's passed now, but she was a well-known comedian and talk show host, and she was very much at the forefront of women comics, kind of coming up. And so she had this really great show called The Joan Rivers Show, and she was very funny herself. And so I was on the show, and I was trying to think about, with some friends of mine, what kind of opportunities I might have in relationship to presenting on this show. So we decided at the time to bring out the words multi-gendered and bisexual as part of a story that I would tell. And so, trying to keep in mind that this is 1992, and it's really before we had language, before we had PGPs, before we tagged our emails, his, him, her, or whatever. That's mine, I guess. And so it was a kind of time that we were trying to interject gender confusion into a mainstream conversation. So I'm going to play a little bit of the video for you, and hopefully I'll be able to come back to the slideshow at this point. But in the video, one thing I want you to look out for is, so all the stories I'm telling are fake. I made them up. And when I tell Joan the story about meeting a fellow exhibitionist at an aquarium who was multi-gendered and bisexual, she says, an aquarium, because she was really caught off guard, because this is not a story she was expecting to hear. So the producers of the show, they interview you, and they get all the stories you're going to tell. They know everything, and they write up little cards for her and information for her. So you can see she has like a note full of a lap full of notes, and she can sort of prompt me with these stories that she already knows I'm going to tell. But in this case, she didn't know about this story, so her response is genuinely surprised. I won't play the whole thing. The whole thing is 7 minutes, so I'll just play up to a bit here. I think it's going to be like.
If you are screening your calls, please pick up.
Can you guys hear that guy?
It's 5:30. It's your wake-up call. You might even be up already. Okay. Bye. See you at Joan Rivers. Bye.
Can you imagine a one-only shoe sale? So why would you imagine a one-only car sale? At Fremont Ford, choose one of 1,000 vehicles.
Today, an eye-opening look at voyeurs. Those are people who get their sexual kicks by watching others, and the others who enjoy being watched. How many of you applaud would turn away if you saw a couple right in the window making love? Okay. How many would stick around kind of behind a tree just to check it out? Okay. Well, my next guest is turned on when he sees things like that. He's a voyeur, and I might add, he's one of the few people who are willing to come forward and to talk about it. And I think that's just terrific. Please welcome Derek Adams. And thank you very much.
You asked your audience how many people would watch, and most of them said yes. How many would stand behind a tree? A lot of them don't want to be discovered.
Yeah. Have you ever been discovered?
How many television shows have I done? I did the Robin Bird Show twice. I did Men in Film twice. I did Voyeur Vision once, and now I've done the Joan Rivers Show. So it's become. This is all in 4 months.
I know. What a
So
career.
I know. I feel like if I just had some sort of talent besides whatever I do, I could be famous.
But you're going to make, that's the talent you have to make this be the talent.
The talent is
Because
just
some
talking. The
people
talent
do
is
this,
making
you know.
working is being able to work with Joan Rivers in front of a camera. That's the talent. But
That's right.
that's not something you can necessarily sell. I mean, because I have to be billed as something.
Oh no, come on. Look at people like Pia Zadora or Jacques Lacour. What talents do they have?
but they have
People
albums.
What about Kreskin? You know, there are people who just come on and they just talk. You know, they have no talent.
Well, that's what that's what I do. I have a talent for talking.
Listen.
That's
you
what
know,
Joan does. That's how Joan is.
You can be a celebrity. Well, she used to do stand-up. I mean, she
Yeah.
used to be a comic.
And it took her forever to get famous.
Well, that's true. But then, my God, yeah, she is. How old do we think she is?
Joan?
55?
Oh, at least. My
She's
mom's
not-
55.
No, I don't think she's older. I don't
I
know.
don't think she's only 55.
I don't know. Dick Clark is 62, if you want to believe that. So,
Dick Clark is 62. Wow.
yeah, so, you know.
My next guest is a voyeur's dream. Derek is so lucky because she is what is called an exhibitionist. She is a woman who likes to flaunt her body. Please welcome Rosa. I asked Derek, he said about 12, he realized he enjoyed watching it. What age did you realize you liked having people look at your body?
Well, actually, it was about the same age.
Same age.
It was about 12.
Pre-puberty.
Maybe that's something the psychologist could talk about later.
Yeah. And did you walk around the house naked in front of relatives and friends and neighbors and postmen and...
Well, not the postman.
Yeah.
But, yeah, relatives and friends. Well, what I would do was I would be in a room and I would undress and I would kind of prance around and just like dust and do things. And then when someone would come in, I would pretend that I didn't know they were there. So it was, you know,
surprise,
it was a surprise.
What about, which we were talking about, as I said, some of our staff said, do you purposely do this now? Do you get undressed in front of open windows? And what do you do to let people see your body?
Well, I do a variety of things. I'm what you might call a stunt exhibitionist.
Which means?
Which means that I prefer to actually dress for exhibitionism and go out and do particular stunts.
Didn't you get undressed on a castle in Europe totally?
I did. When I was traveling in Europe, one of the most interesting forms of exhibition I did was to go to castles and climb the tallest tower, which was actually quite dangerous, and take off all my clothes and get in sort of an Art Deco pose for the tourists. I once met a fellow exhibitionist, quite by mistake, a really wonderful, multi-gendered, ambisexual person at an aquarium.
An aquarium?
Yeah. And his name is Stafford, and we were watching the divers feed the large fish, and I was really attracted to him, and so I unzipped my dress and I started rubbing up against the aquarium. And she walked over to the aquarium and unzipped her pants and began doing the same thing.
This woman that you met?
Yes.
All right.
This woman. Yes.
All right. Was it a man or a woman? When they unzipped their pants, what did we see? Was it a man or woman? Just tell me what the diver saw.
She said fellow.
She did have a penis.
All right.
I'm not going to play the whole thing, but my response was she did have a penis at the end of that sort of go around, and it's on my Vimeo. So if you want to watch the whole thing, you can do that. But here's a work called Now's Under the Rug, in which I lay under a rug. This is at Yerba Buena Center for about 45 minutes with a microphone, kind of responding to things around me. And so wanting to kind of give you different frameworks around, you know, the vulnerability of the body, allowing people to feed on my body, disappearing the body, and the different aspects in which, you know, I choose to sort of create complications, I would say, for the body. Here's an endurance work called San Gravity, in which I tape a plastic bag of water on my head, around my neck, and then I eventually have to break the bag. It's a very short endurance work, you know, because I can't really hold my breath for that long, but I did get pretty good at it. And when I did this work, I really was thinking more about, I'm also really good with water, I should say. I swim in the ocean and lakes and, you know, big bodies of water, and I have a very good relationship to water. So even though it was really scary for me to put my head inside of this bag of water and tape it on in some ways, it's also kind of, people, like when you see it live, it's really funny and horrifying. And I think, you know, again, these are sort of areas that I tend to trade in, which is sort of the sorry, you know, like laughing at something and then being sorry that you laughed, because what if, you know, what if something were to happen? This is the work Deathbed. This is a photo of the work Deathbed, in which I was sort of imagining how, sort of the prompt for Deathbed was, if somebody found me dead, how would I want to look? And so I was sort of creating this photo performance. I say photo performance, but it gets confusing because I was creating a photo, but the performance of trying to create the photo, which was this idea of trying to enact a last breath, sort of a leaving the body through the eyes and through the mouth and through the breath, of trying to create a photo where I looked like I was dead or very at the space between alive and dead became its own performance. And so I ended up restaging this photo as a work, as a performance work. So when the viewer comes in the gallery, they see the screen, the video, and it's playing a video. And the video is essentially this photo where it is cut out so that my face appears. Does this have a pointer on it? No? It does? Oh, hey, what do you know? So this is like the photo that we saw here, right? But the photo is cut out so that my face appears inside the scene, and it's angled like there's a video camera where it's angled, so that when people come in, they think it's, I mean, it's just a very strange illusion, because it's my live face on a photo background, and I'm trying to re-perform this last breath kind of ritual, and then when you come around the corner, there I am on this weird slant board. It's yeah, this is the live projection of what this is, of this relationship here. And the reason I'm telling you, I guess, about this work also is because this was the work I made in order to get on Work of Art. So they had us create a piece of work as an audition in order to get on the show. And so Deathbed was the work I created to be selected for the show. And then the first challenge was a portrait of other contestants. And Miles, who I was paired with, he made a portrait of me dead without knowing about this other work. So that was kind of intriguing to me. You saw this photo already, the cast. This is my tagline from the show. I'm not responsible for your experience of my work. I played a kind of more evil version of myself, and I sort of played this version of myself that was sort of, a more, like an older artist, a kind of know-it-all who wasn't impressed with anybody, essentially. And that was how I got on the show, too, because you kind of need to have, you need to offer the producers something that they're not going to get from somebody else. So that was kind of my experience, but actually the experience of being in the show was quite difficult because I kept feeling literally my mask slipping like that persona. Couldn't quite keep it up, and it was very stressful for me. I like to say that show pushed me into menopause because I was on my period the whole time I was there shooting for about 3 weeks, and then after that it was just like so stressful, and I had like a hill spur that I didn't know, like I didn't know what that was. So I was like in this pain, and I was really anemic from bleeding so much, and I had this show that I had to prepare for in Berlin, which was the show that Jose invited me to, which was the work Silver and Gold. And it's so interesting because you were saying how I said about the work that I got kicked off for. It's so beautiful that I could scream. Did you read that?
It was the closing interview that they have.
Yes.
Confessional.
Yeah. Okay, well that's so interesting because I must have been peppering it with the work that I was working on, because that's a line like from Mario Montez in a Jack Smith tape, like in a Jack Smith, I guess it was a taping that they ended up releasing on one of these CDs where Mario's like playing Maria Montez and saying, I'm so happy I could, or that's so beautiful I could scream, and then he goes on to scream a bunch. So that's interesting that I kind of was moving back and forth between those spaces. I was trying to leave this show desperately at the time to get to work on the Berlin show, and this was the work I got kicked off on. Partly, I tried to do things that I thought would get me kicked off, so I made a costume out of the sponsorship bags, which was Utrecht. It was like the sponsor of the show was this art store called Utrecht. So I made a costume from that. And then this friend of mine who gave me a painting lesson just before I went on the show, a wonderful painter named Cheto Castellano, he told me, never mix colors to the point where you get to brown, because nobody likes a brown painting. And so I really went for that. I went for this kind of oozing brown paint situation. And, the way that we were making work on the show was kind of absurd for me, because it was, there would be a prompt. So in this case, it was the episode was shock, create something shocking. And then they would take you to the art store and give you maybe $100, and then they would give you about 12 hours to make the work. And I'm somebody who will sit on an idea for like 5 years before I even write it down, and I have all these, what I call, my process, I call it like a brain burr. Like if I have an idea in my head that won't go away, it just goes for a bunch of years, and then I finally have to find a way to create it, eventually. And so it was a strange experience. I very much felt like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, like there's no place like home. I felt like, wow, I had created this wonderful life for myself in a way that I was an artist, primarily working in an underground scene. I had a lot of great contact with academics and scholars. I had students, and I was making my art, and I was feeling really great about that. And then I went on this TV show, and it was just like a kind of horrifying process for me, very stressful. And but I did end up kind of going into a kind of mainstream space, and I got a lot of nice fan letters like this one from Haley. It's a style I've never seen before. I'm 15, and when I grow up, I want to be an artist. I love how you get to express yourself through paintings. I'm not sure what she was talking about, unless she was talking about the work I got kicked off on, and I guess that was pretty expressive. But anyways, yeah, I would get a lot of really sweet emails like this, and I also got trolled a lot, and primarily trolled for my body and for my aggressive behavior on the show. And so here's an example of some of the trolling. And when I saw this, I actually thought, this is great. Like, I thought it was sort of about me being powerful. And then I went to the link. It was on Flickr, if you remember that. And there was this really nice, literally like a soccer mom, young lady who, had pictures of herself with her kids. They were playing soccer and whatnot. And she talked about the show, and she said, there's this new show on Work of Art. It's a great show, except this one artist, now Bustamante. She makes me so mad that I stayed up all night making this collage of her. And so I was really happy about that, because I thought, well, if I could inspire somebody to make art, then I'm doing my job on the show. And also my strategy on the show wasn't to win. Unfortunately, I might have done better. I got kicked off after the 4th episode. I might have done better if I had been strategizing to win, but my strategy was actually to do things I didn't know how to do, and to sort of expose the process of an artist to mainstream TV. So not to do things that I knew how to do well, but to actually do things that I didn't know how to do. So I think that was, maybe not the best strategy. Just note to self, if you're ever on a reality TV show, just take things you know how to do and just do those. It's probably, but about the same time, I was asked to be in this show from Chewbacca to Zapata, re-envisioning the myth of the Mexican Revolution. But what I want to say is that towards the end of the show, and when it aired, people were saying, you really should do work about the show. And I said, no, the show was the work. Like, I did the work, and it was the show. And but I started imagining this dress that was like a full-length dress, like a kind of protective talisman that would protect me from these slings and arrows, protect me from the universe, protect me from the mainstream and ugly comments. And so I imagined this dress that was a full-length dress, with a high neck, all the way sleeves, and all the way down to the floor, and it was going to be made out of Kevlar. And about that time, I did get this invitation. And I wasn't really sure if I would participate, but I started looking into the Mexican Revolution, and I found that there were these women brigades, and this is more of a kind of a little bit more of a middle-class women's brigade, but they were wearing the dresses that I had imagined. And so I thought, well, I will make the dress for them to protect them. So I ended up making a kind of Edwardian Kevlar dress that was styled after the women who were in these these fighting brigades during the Mexican Revolution. And then I ended up testing the dress against the weapons of the time. Here I have an old Winchester that was a commonly used rifle in the Mexican Revolution. The dress itself did end up stopping a 9mm slug. You could see it just embedded there in the apron bib of the dress. And it kind of frayed the edges when it would shoot it like a cartoon. So I was really pretty impressed with the dress at that point. I mean, it wouldn't stand up to weapons. These current weapons, you need a lot more layers of Kevlar. I think the apron bib and the dress and everything maybe had about 5 layers of Kevlar. But I would need a lot more to have any chance against current weaponry. And the way that Kevlar works, I thought it was very poetic and a great through line, which is it doesn't work because it's so thick and it stops a bullet. It works because each thread is very fine and it's spun with other threads, and then those threads are woven in such a way that when something hits it, it sends an impact throughout the garment. And so it's really like a one-time use, protective material. So if you had a Kevlar vest, for instance, and you were shot at, and it took the impact of a bullet, you wouldn't be able to use it again because the impact has then deteriorated the fabric. And I thought that was just so interesting as a kind of metaphor for community, that all of these different threads could kind of work together to take an impact. It wasn't that that material was so strong that nothing could penetrate, but that it would impact and then it would disperse. I ended up going on and looking into the collections. After this one dress, I ended up continuing the work, as Maka said, and presented a solo show at VPAM. And I did research in the special collections at UC Riverside, and they have a really large bank of photos from the Mexican Revolution, which is also called the most well-documented, is that correct English? The most well-documented war of our time, because it was at the advent of photography. So this is an example of something that might have been turned into a postcard and sent around, right? But there weren't that many photos of women who were there fighting in the Mexican Revolution. And so when they would show up in the archive, they would come out, and I would just feel so connected to them and to these women. These are women that follow alongside soldiers in the field, and they act as the hospital, as comfort women, as mothers, as wives, as they make food for them. And if it hadn't been for these women who followed alongside this 10-year war, which was largely fought for, the rights of then peasants who were illiterate, and it was an agrarian war, who had no sort of standing in society at all. If it hadn't been for the women flowing with these brigades and sort of shape-shifting on the field, they wouldn't have been able to reach their ultimate ends. This is probably my favorite photo from the archive. And it's just such a magical photo. It just goes, it feels like it crosses time itself because of this kind of blown out quality and because of the kind of spots, that were probably from water on the negative. But I love this photo so much, and I have often meditated on this photo when making the work. I ended up finding a script from this Russian filmmaker named Eisenstein, who's a real seminal filmmaker, was often credited with contemporary editing kind of methods. And he wrote a script called Soldadera, which never was filmed. And it was part of a work called Que Viva Mexico, which you can find on YouTube. And the work was about this soldadera named Panchita. And I ended up using his script and shooting it. He never ended up making it. Making multiple Kevlar dresses, each one sort of taken, the style of it taken from a photograph from the archive, and placing these women on photos from the special collection. These are stills from that short film. Ultimately, my journey took me to Zapopan, Mexico, where I met the last survivor of the Mexican Revolution, a woman named Becerra Lumbreras. And she was amazing. She was 127 years old when I met her. She was the oldest woman in the world, which is... Yeah, she was 127 when I met her. And she was the oldest woman in the world at the time. And she was the last survivor of the Mexican Revolution, and her family had all these great stories about her, about how, she had never taken on a husband. She had 3 sons, and she was part of the Women's Brigade during the Mexican Revolution. She had 3 sons during that time when she was part of these follow units. And after the war was over, the story goes that all the men stood in line to get land, and she was the only woman who stood in land, according to the legend, her family. And she stood in line, and she told, when she got to the front of the line, she said, "I've had 3 sons during the Mexican Revolution, and I want land for them." And apparently they gave her the land, or gave her some land, and along the way, she outlived all her children and ended up with these sort of second, distant cousins in another town, and was eventually located by some of her grandchildren who were in their 70s. And she was relocated to this home in Zapopan, where she was able to live out her life and meet some of her great-great-grandchildren. I ended up videoing her and placing her inside of this kind of spoof on VR. It's a stereoscopic viewer from the era of, kind of the Mexican Revolution. It's like from 1890 or so, around there. And I sort of tricked it out with wooden headphones by a young artist named Jared Davis, who's really talented. And when we were at her house, guavas were in season, and so I placed these fresh guavas underneath, and you had to kind of bend down. Well, you had to sit on the stool to view, and in the stool I had a kind of, like booty base, like they have in car seats. So you'll see with the video, she's clapping, and there's a kind of bass in the video. So as the viewer sits there, they see her in a kind of stereoscopic way, they hear her, they smell the guava, and they also feel the rhythm in their butt. So, and the sculpture forces the viewer into a position that to me looks very much like that of a time traveler or an astronaut, kind of, leaping off. I call the work chakmul because of the position that she is in, which is a kind of a pre-colonial statue, and where this figure, the chakmul, is a figure that nobody has really fully been able to define. There's all these conferences about the chakmul, about what gender is the chakmul, and that kind of thing. But they're thought of as a figure that takes warriors between life and death. So I'm going to play this video for you, and I'll leave you with that. Because she's talking about Pancha. Pancha was a common name for women soldiers at the time. We'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks for sticking around, and I guess we can have a little conversation now. Hello.
She wants to jump in.
Jump in.
Thank you so much. That was so rich and wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. I was feeling so many things during both your talks. I'm afraid I don't have maybe the words to ask a question, but I was feeling lots of things. And so my question, if it is a question, is just about the relationship between the senses and sensory stimulation and abjection, because on the one hand, there were all these examples of don't overmix or never mix paint to this point that it's like gray or, this brown color that nobody wants. Or that emotional vibrator that you just do too much and so then you're just left bored, after all of this crying. And then on the other hand, there is the sort of revivification of the senses in your work, that is in stark contrast to the ways in which the media sort of directs our senses, numbs our senses. So yeah, the relationship between senses and abjection and, yeah.
Do you want to answer that? I'm going to let you say something,
Sure.
and then I'm going to respond.
Yeah, then you'll jump in.
Because I'm just so interested in Letty's take on things.
I mean, for me, the fact that now very purposefully activates often ambivalent or contrasting senses is precisely against standard understood decorum for art reception, right? And not just medium, right? But we're supposed to behave a certain way in the white cube of the gallery, in the museum space, and that her work doesn't let us, right? Like that you're sitting on a vibrating anything surrounded by people, right, completely changes the social experience and the aesthetic possibilities, I think, which I just find so generative, right? And abjection for me is about precisely combining those contradictory affects in a way that is really generative, right? So I think you honed in exactly on those feelings that led me to her work and to other, the other artists in my book. But that's, it's like I have all those feelings too, and can I make them into words and have those be sentences and a book? And I did, but I still have those feelings, and I still sometimes think about the best, trying to find the best words to approximate what I experience in front of Nell's work. And so when you're talking about like the vulnerability that you feel listening to folks talk about your work, like I feel that whenever I watch your work, right? Like watching the killing of Given Over to Want was so intense. I was sitting in the front row for those pictures, and I think you knew we were there. And Jen Doyle was there. There was like a group of us that went together, and I feel like now had this knife that we could be like, oh my God, does she know where the knife is? And the smell of wine was it almost like made us throw up. And to think that she was just imbibing, right? And so just the experience of being around Nell's work, I like go back to those moments where you tell us to, like, just leave your body, right? Yeah. It's like, okay, I gotta leave to experience, but the work doesn't let me, right? Mm-hmm. It makes me stay right there in a really uncomfortable way.
Yeah, I think, what Lethia's talking about in the work in Didgeridoo, there's a line where I say, because it's a work that sort of is tumbling, between making fun of, ritual performance art and these kind of race relation conversations and kind of everyone tiptoeing around these ideas. And so at some point I just say, if you're uncomfortable with this work, I just want to encourage you to leave your body. And it's also a reference to kind of survivor techniques, like when you have to survive some kind of abuse, like a really great technique is just to leave your body. And I think that some of my work practices kind of come out of this. Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm so emotional. I think I might be having that fake breakdown now. It's like it's like clearing of the throat can make people feel that you're sincere. As does also lowering your voice an octave. That's when people think it's getting really serious. But that helps me. It helps me to kind of laugh, to bring me back in. But I was trying to think about that, initial, like where that kind of comes from in my work. And I do think there's something, kind of comes from maybe like a discovering myself through kind of punk rock practices or something like that. This idea of like an insistence on an interjection or an insistence on presence. And I think even when the work is not completely, bombastic in some way, I think there's this there's a kind of it's weird because personally I'm very like controversial adverse. Like even when I try to do all these different tests to determine my personality type, I'm controversial adverse. Like I'll do anything to get out of a controversy. I don't like controversy. I want to just kind of scoot around things. I like to go around.
I don't believe you.
It's true, but in my work, like my personality is controversial adverse, but in my work, it's really about kind of just putting my finger on it, or taking the knife and stabbing it, or, and I think that there's something about performance art that's about expressing things that we all want to express, and we don't necessarily have, like when all else fails, there's always performance art. There's a kind of expressive quality to it that goes beyond decorum and language. And I think about that. I think about this kind of space of presenting something that maybe others have not seen, but there's something also quite familiar about it. So there's all these things kind of working in tandem, which I think create the tension for the work to create like friction. And I think, that's what's really great about the live, because if we don't you know, if we don't kind of acknowledge the present, the live or the presence, and being present with each other, then we, you know, can get swept into all these states in which we live in a more isolated existence, essentially. So I kind of went off topic, but
It's okay.
yeah.
Thank you for being here. I think it's an honor for all of us, and thank you, Leticia. I think it was like a beautiful reading of your performances. There's a lot of like heaviness as well, I think, in the discussion of abjection and sort of the demands to constantly be exceptional under all instances, and the toll that it takes on your soul and your mind and your body. So I was just wondering if you could discuss also like what healing looks like then in your performances, but also like for yourself through the process of the creation of your art. Thank you.
I think I have come to accept myself more clearly through my art, and also my art is really like, I don't have any other choice. I don't have any options.
I also noted, though, Neo, your presentation title, right, from vulnerability to protection, right, and thinking about the way that your work really placed your body and your whole self in a really vulnerable position in relationship to the audience, and then creating these dresses, right, and then removing your body in some instances, right, and I wonder if that is a different moment for you in art making, in the world, in sociality.
I've got my sunglasses.
Yeah.
These are hard questions.
Yeah, but thinking about the presence of your body in that performance at the Broad, and how haunting it was, not just because it in its very creation mobilized the ghosts of America the Beautiful, right? But itself was about releasing more into the world, right? And activating ghosts to serve us in a way. So but I feel like there's a similar, I don't know, you tell me what you think, right? These dresses that you made for protection also feel haunted, right? They also feel vivified or almost like there's something, that picture that you showed that was your favorite with that kind of built-in Instagram filter almost, with the speckles. There's if I could use the word aura, right, that then come to the dresses as well, So I feel basically like you're a bruja, like you're doing something with ghosts for us, and haunting that really comes into your work.
I would agree with that. I'll say I'm a brujan.
Totally.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that is, kind of making those sort of claims is not something I usually do, because I feel like it's a whole practice in and of itself that I don't really participate in. But I do think there is, some kind of magic in performance practice that has to do with bringing everyone into the same space, very much like you would when you're kind of laying a spell out, or, in a kind of religious service or something,
Sure.
which is sort of all about us all being together, trying to experience something together. And I think that as simple as it sounds, I think that there is some, kind of magic to that, or some kind of, I hear all the time, people tell me all the time that they feel like they can relate to the work, or it always reminds them of some other experience that they've had, or they kind of go into some kind of, space of healing or trauma or something. I hear that from people a lot. Yeah.
Kind of to
question, more like a comment or a conversation, I guess. But that it really struck me how that your work is like, I mean, so many of your works are just kind of beyond language, and there's something about them that is beyond articulation, really, and it's really that is what that kind of particular quality of it captures something about the object in a very particular way, because that which is kind of that which doesn't articulation has no access to it, and so it, like, you know, and I just wanted to ask you if you could speak about that, and like the kind of how it takes like this kind of form of, you know, performance, or, you know, the temporal aspects, the visual aspects of that, and you know, and it really, it seems to me like captures almost like another psychic dimension, what you were saying about like the, you know, the healing aspect of it, or, you know, there's, you know, it sort of taps into another psychic dimension. So,
does anyone else want to comment on that too? Because I feel like that might be something that is best perceived in a way, you know, outside of myself.
I mean, it's interesting that you use the word magic, right? When I was using the language of haunting, and if anything, the work actually grounds me in the present, in the material. It's almost a complete opposite reaction to what you're saying, right? Which is the richness of the work, which is in part why I try to understand Nao's performances by thinking about what is happening, right? And trusting her, really thinking about the work as theorizing, right? And especially thinking through kind of the dynamics of being minoritized in a particular way, or resisting those dynamics, right? Yeah, but you know, the kind of rubric that I find most helpful is thinking about the aesthetic as emerging within structures of feeling, right? And inform this. You know, this is why I did that whole thing in both of the works that I think connects it, but and the way that the liveness of it changes the performance, right? So for Given Over to Want, when you performed it, the way that it accumulated meaning and accumulated objects, right? The addition of the flowers, the wine. So the works change in the material and the environs in a way that I think really grounds the work for me. But I know, I had a question, if I'm allowed. I know, I had a question. Nao, about the performance remains that you've told me a little bit about that I thought might be interesting. So like one of the things when I teach in Didgeridoo, and then we follow the wigs, right? So when you said, you know, this persona is the same persona as Rosa does Joan, I was like, of course, it's the wig. And so there are certain things that I follow, right? Like the citrus shoe, the Elvira wig, the citrus shoes, right? I think about the stained sheets. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about those objects, where they live.
Yeah, well, some of them are in the landfill somewhere, who knows. I thought it might be useful also related to the last question, just thinking about, I just wanted to tell you guys that the work, I don't actually rehearse work. And it's a kind of process that I do, which I just call it embodiment, because that's essentially what it is, or kind of channeling, which is that I tap into the work, and when I perform the work, I have to kind of take a dive into the embodiment of the work. So, although I do have I have structure, I have technical structure, so that I can communicate with people and say, I'm going to do this here and I'm going to do that there. But then in between all of that technical structure, there's no kind of adherence to a kind of expression. So I allow the kind of character that I'm embodying to sort of take over, to find new expression. And then each time I do the work, I sort of forget things and remember things. And I lose props and I gain props, you know, depending on sort of what I have available to me. But the remnants, I did end up starting to collect the sheets at a certain point. I have done that work several times, and when I was in Mexico City, I did what I usually did, which is I kind of, you know, cut all the stuff off of me, put it in a bag and threw it in a dumpster, and then went out and had drinks. And then at a certain point in the evening, the sheet started talking to me. It sort of started saying, "Why did you leave me in this dumpster? What's the deal with that? Like, we had this great night, and you know, I thought we had a thing going on, and then all of a sudden I'm here in the dark with a bunch of trash, and I don't know where you are anymore." So I started collecting the sheets, and I have started displaying them and installing them in different ways. And I kind of keep track of which performance it was, so each sheet has a different kind of markings, you know, from the type of wine to the type of dirt, you know, to the type of marks, to the tape. And then in that work, in order to get the eye holes and stuff, as part of the shadow play, I smoke a cigarette behind the sheet, and then I burn holes into the sheet. And so they'd have different kind of burn marks and that kind of thing. So the sheets have become sort of their own thing. And when you put them all together, it is very creepy. It's kind of haunting, you know, because they're all these kind of weird, discolored sheep with faces. It's like I have these friends back in the studio that are all folded up in their little bags. And I don't know, at a certain point, I reuse, but I also collect. So the America the Beautiful suitcase that I used to take on the road with me, it's a really small, sort of old, like vintage, you know, kind of hard camel-colored suitcase. And the piece before that was a lot of trouble. I had a backdrop, and I had larger props, and I had made this huge headdress and everything, and I thought, oh, the next piece I just want to be easy. And so I still have at home my little suitcase, you know, and it still has like a blonde wig and the gold powder and the shoes and gloves. So it has all the elements. So I kind of keep all these things sort of set aside, but I don't know. I think I'm probably due for a mid-career retrospect or something. So I keep, you know, it's the kind of work that, like, I'm not part of the gallery system. I'm not part of like the commercial art frameworks. And I mean, it's not that I reject them. It's just that there hasn't been a way for us to really be a part of each other's worlds, I guess I could say, is the nicest thing I could say. Nobody knows what to do with me. It's not even, I mean, it's like, it's weird because it's sort of like I became an artist not through the regular channels. I did end up going to art school after practicing art for about 15 years because I thought, well, I'm going to be an artist, so I should go to art school. And that was really fun and really great for me to do that. I learned a lot of things, a lot of information about history going to art school. So I was happy I did that. But, you know, when I was always very intimidated by art when I was younger, and the kind of weight that it had and sort of what it might mean, what it was sort of standing in for. And so I came to art in a very strange way. I came to it through dance, and then from dance I started performing. And I think that now, you know, performance is really emerging as a kind of almost like popular art in a weird way. Like, there are so many people doing performance, so many younger performers and older performers who are more well recognized now. And so that's really interesting for me to kind of live through that shift and to kind of still be performing as well.
I had a question that was the exact opposite of yours. Instead of thinking about remnants and afterlives, I was thinking of what happens before the performance. Right here, I really appreciated that you showed us your primary sources, because then I started thinking, a lot of work is behind these very, very rich performances. So I wanted to ask you, where do ideas come from for you? How do they prompt you? And what do you do? Is there like a creative process that you have already established, or is it more fluid? So there's no process already established for the performance, but what happens before then?
Yeah, I think that the work usually comes from like an image that flashes in my mind. So with America the Beautiful, the image was just taping my body. And so the first iteration of that was in this performance festival that was an improv festival. And I ended up pulling some people from the audience, and they got naked, and I taped them up and put wigs on them. And then at that point, the work started building a narrative around beauty in the body. And then with the blonde wig, when the blonde wig came into the picture, then it became kind of more like an Americanized, ideal of, white feminine beauty that would be just kind of pushed to its like grotesque space. And so I think what happens for me is there's a strong image that enters, and then there's the opportunity that I'm intersecting with that's happening in my life at that time. Like, what possibilities are there? And then there's the, I guess, the building out of that over time. So, usually I don't work in maybe a traditional theatrical way, which would be, to research, to write, to workshop, to rehearse, and then to tour. So what I do is I have an image, and then I try it out in front of people. And then the next time I have an invitation and it seems appropriate, I'll try it out again. And that goes on for many years for a single work. But then I rotate a lot of works in that space. And now I've been in the space of trying to, like with Soldadera, I'm trying to make works that have a bit more, that have more research and have more moving parts. And I have also another career as a filmmaker that isn't really expressed here. But I'm working with somebody who's doing a film retrospective of my film work this year. This group, Dirty Looks LA, that present like queer experimental film. And so, I have different, also, like as an artist, I have different kind of mediums that have their own kind of history, in which some of them I'm really young in and some of them I'm really old in, and they kind of keep it's like they're tumbling around inside of me. And so a lot of it has to do with opportunity. Like, I'm trying to work on a 360 film, right? 360 film now that's sort of taken from the Mayan origin myth, and it sort of takes a different class of people. Each character represents a different class. And so in the Mayan origin myth, there's this point, like they keep remaking people over and over till they get to who we are now. But they go through a phase and they kind of skip over it in the origin myth, which is they get to a phase where they make people that are wooden, and they call them the wooden people. And the wooden people are not right, and they, burn them and destroy them. But I'm trying to make this like 360, I guess, like web telenovela that's set, like the wooden people are the main characters, and it's set in like a kind of contemporary Los Angeles, and they're like ancient people, but they sort of represent a subculture like goths or something like that, you know, in a cultural context. So these kind of works, they take a really long time to develop because, you know, I have to come up with the ideas, and then I have to get people on board, and then I have to script them out, and then I have to fundraise for them, and then I have to find, you know, so those kind of works take a really long time, whereas other works might be, I don't know what I'm doing, I have a gig, I have a flash of an image, I'm going to try out this thing. That was how it was when I was younger. Now I don't really like that feeling anymore of not knowing what I'm doing. I like the feeling of knowing what I'm doing, but not knowing how I'm going to do it. So the stress of really not knowing, I've kind of almost X'd that out of my life now, because it's just too stressful.
So when you mentioned your films, I was thinking about your films, and you know, I guess this is for both of you in some ways. I mean, I know that the head and the face is the body, but we talk a lot about embodiment and body in your work. And sometimes I think about it separately in your work, and I'm not sure why. And I think because, in part, your face has such a range of gestural expressions to it, and it reminds me of, like, I mean, it's very, you know, and we've talked about this, when you film like Silver and Gold, I mean, there are close-ups of your face, it's so beautiful, it's really, like, it has this really rich colored saturation to it that reminds me of like Hollywood work, or kind of a diva in that sense. But I think that it is for both of you, because I think we know that the work is feminist and queer, and it fits within a certain genealogy because it's about the body embodiment, you know, confusions, etc. But what about the face? Like, how do we think about the face as part of the performative or the acting work? All that comes through and exudes the expressiveness of the face. Does that make sense?
Face,
Yeah.
Face, beauty face.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why, I keep coming back to that.
Yeah, I think it's the face, and the face is like the site of all emotion, right? And so, in the way that vulnerability is expressed through, you know, tears or through openness or something, I think that, that is sort of the site at which we understand each other and we communicate to each other. So, you know, reading cues. I mean, we read the body cues as well. And I think that gives a good opportunity for a performer to create these contradictory spaces too, because if the body's doing one thing and the face is doing another thing, you know, then you can kind of create that space. I don't know. There's something like in being present. I just did a talk where it was for undergrads, and they said to me, you know, all of this stuff you're talking about sounds great, but how do we find time? Because we're so busy with our schoolwork and, you know, our relationships to our families and our friends, and then we have to work. And I said, you know, the only way to make time is by being present. And that is the only way that you could produce additional time. And of course, we can only take being present so much. You know, like at a certain point, you have to drop off into oblivion, you know, binge watch TV or whatever. So it's not that, you know, I'm a Buddhist monk or anything, but I think in this space where we're talking about with the face and the body doing different things, I also, or we call it tension, but I also think of it as a kind of crunch, like a psychic crunch or visual crunch, as a way to bring people in the present moment. So it's a kind of technique that has to do with kind of squeezing time and like insisting that everybody is there with you. And I think in that way it's kind of like creates the stress, which brings us all back into the present again, you know. And so I appreciate you bringing up my face.
When I think of Nao's face in performance, I want to say her eyes that are probably well, because you do this thing, right, where you open up your eyes really big, and it both like draws us in, but also makes us so uncomfortable because I want you to blink, right? Like, and makes me so aware of the vulnerability of your entire person on stage. But I think of what your eyes and mouth are doing in America the Beautiful when you deny us your face, right? When you cover it up. In like those fancy like Hollywood glamour photos that you had taken, right? When you parody a particular aesthetic principally through your face, and it for me as a viewer, it ends up just being a really supple part of your performance, right? That it's funny, Maka, your question, I never thought of the face as removed from embodiment, but as amplifying, or working to bring complexity to what some might, where some might be tempted to read coherence in and through the body. It actually undoes the body in a way.
Yeah, I think also in my performance, I give a lot of clues to people that I'm in control, even though I appear out of control. And that, I think, helps people settle in a little bit, because it's sort of this teetering between control and out of control that people want to experience because, well, I'll just say it. I think there are two kinds of people in the world. People who like to be confused and people who don't like to be confused. And so I like to be confused myself, but other people hate to be confused. They want to know what everything means. And so I think, if I could give people meaning to grab onto on their way to confusion. So it's like kind of a dance in a way between confusion, or meaning and confusion, and control and danger and those kind of things that I go back. And the face, I think, is a big part of that. Because if I can look at you and you can see in my eyes that I have clarity about what I'm doing and that, I'm just not like off my rocker or something, then you'll trust me a little bit more to go deeper with me. So I do think of each performance as a kind of like, come on, kids, let's go on a journey with me. Like I have this kind of feeling that each performance for me has an entry and an exit point. And I try to bring people in, kind of slowly, like it's like doing a magic trick where I show you all the parts of the magic and you still don't believe it. Like you still are like, how did I get here?
Yeah.
How did we get to this point? With the given over to want thing, it's like you see me take my clothes off, you see me tape, you see me burn the holes, you see me tape the sheet on, you see me put the box of wine on my head, and you see me plunge a knife, you see all the parts building, but then next thing you know, you're looking at something that you're like, what the hell is this? So I think that's, for me, like, exciting. It's kind of like, the work that I got kicked off for the work of art, where I had that weird Playtex mask on. That was another person's piece that they were pouring latex, and that was like the bottom of their bucket. And I just like went and got the bottom of the bucket, the latex pour, and I just like taped it on my face. And I was doing these things that, and then I had two places I could be. I had a very simple script. I either had to be sitting in my chair, stroking my shit flower and squeezing brown paint out, or I had to be holding a glass of wine and looking at other artwork. So that was my whole script for the evening. And my favorite part about that work wasn't actually the performance. It was when the show aired and the camera panned across the participants, and then you could see my really messed up face, you know, with everyone else's normal faces. To me, that was the art. So sometimes I think about like the art being made in like a specific moment, you know, that isn't necessarily about the whole work, but it might be a couple of really great seconds that I hang on to. And I say, oh, that was the thing that that wasn't my intention, but when I saw the piece aired, I like laughed so hard when that shot happened and just panned across the contestants, and there was my weird face.
I think you'd even like torn out of the Utrecht bag so like you could breathe. It was like mangled.
Yeah, I think at some point when we were doing the crits, yeah. And then later they let me, I mean, I wrote a work, I have to send it to you, for Artillery magazine about that night, because that was like one of the most abject experiences of my life. Like I said, I was pushed into menopause, I was in pain, I taped myself into this costume that had to be worn for taping, so it was had it on for about 8 hours or something. And I couldn't go to the bathroom, and then finally I cut myself out of it. Like I cut a crotch hole to go pee, but then I was wearing all this like colorful tissue on the inside, and then I accidentally peed on all the tissue, but then we were still taping, so I had to like tape myself back up into this like colorful pee tissue paper that was inside the plastic, and it was just like one of the most abject moments of my whole entire life.
Well, I'm just thinking about that because one of the guest judge on that episode was Andres Serrano,
yeah.
Right? And when China
really
Chow was like, "Is that shit?" and he's like, "I don't smell anything," but that just makes me think. As the day progressed, right, the smells that emerged, that changed the experience of that performance or the reception of that performance. Must have been really great.
Well, it was funny because Andres Serrano, they kind of stood in front of me and like were like watching and talking about it like I wasn't there. And they were like, well, what do you think? And he said, well, this is probably the weirdest thing I've seen. I remember he said that. I laughed really hard. Anyway, I think we're really super at time, but you guys have been a great audience.
Thank you.
I feel like we all feel like it's been a really special experience. So thank you so
I
much.
love the intimacy. Everybody got so close.
I know. Thank you guys. Thanks for sticking around. It's really a fun conversation.
Last survivor of the Mexican River, that woman, what is she playing and singing?
She's playing a cookie tin. Yeah. That, actually the stuff that I went there to shoot, we ended up not using any of it that I shot for this piece. There were points where she kept clapping her hands, and that's present in another video. She kept doing this rhythm, and so I asked her family if they had any drums or something she could hit. And one of the things I said was, maybe you have, cookie tin. So they brought in a cookie tin that said, "Have a nice day" on it. And I handed it to her, and she was, and she kind of went to town.
She totally went for it, yeah.
And that was after we'd been shooting, and they were afraid she was getting too tired, so they put her back in bed. Her bed was a couch that was shoved against the wall, with the back of the couch that could come. They custom made a couch. She was really tiny, really frail, and she had a regular bed, but they found her like on the floor trying to escape, and so they had to make this like crib for her. And when I went to see her, it was like seeing a relic, in the sort of the back part of the house. She just was so small. She just was like deep inside of the couch, shoved up against the wall. Like, is there a person in there? It was like a baby in a crib kind of thing.
Her feet looked so tiny.
She was really tiny. And when I touched her, and I was like, coming out of these collections and then touching her, I was like, I'm actually touching the Mexican Revolution right now. Like, it was so profound to meet her. And I feel like every time the video plays that she's like giving a blessing. You know?
Yeah.
I hope you felt that.
Is she still with us?
She's not with us. I shot her in January, and then she passed the April after that.
Wow.
When I found her, and everyone was sort of dragging their feet, I was kind of like, you guys, she's 127 years old. We don't know how long she's going to, you know, how many more days she has. So we kind of, I kind of push people to go there quicker. But
Yeah. Wow.
yeah, thank you.